Well, welcome back, everyone. Today I'm honored to be joined by Mr. Jeff Calhoun. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, happy to be here. Thanks for asking me to be on your show.
It is a pleasure to have you. Talk to me about Tactical Civics. What's the origin of that whole idea?
Yeah, it began close to 18 years ago. Two brothers, David and Oscar Zuniga. They were both engineers by profession. David was an architectural engineer, and I believe Oscar is an electrical engineer. And I think it was around 2007, 2008, maybe just around the Obama election. And, they basically just were sitting and going, how did we get where we are now? And if you kind of trace the several years leading up to that, in 2001 with 9/11, following that, the introduction of the Patriot Act, which was a significant encroachment by the government on civil liberties in the name of security. And then they began the war on terror, which, of course, what is a war on terror but a war that can just go on and on and on because you don't really
Right.
have a defined enemy. They just started asking questions. How did we get here? And David was, he had started and built several classical Christian schools. He had been a missionary pilot, scuba instructor, had a pretty full and successful career, and really started crying out to God, saying, God, show me what's going on and show me if I can actually make a difference. And he went into kind of a sequestered 14-month sabbatical where he read about 100 books, did a lot of praying, was building a house at the time. And from that began this, the seeds were planted, and the genesis of the vision for Tactical Civics was kind of birthed in that 14-month period. And he started sharing with his brother the things that he felt like God was showing him. Really around our founding principles, but more than our founding principles, the structure of government that placed we the people in a really unique place. and he started seeing how all these pieces fit together, was seeing where some of the problems began, and over time different people came alongside him. Probably around 45 people over the past 17 years that have joined him in devoting thousands and thousands of hours. I think the calculation at this point is around 80,000 hours of research and development.
Wow.
By about 45 people, and different people have come along and joined him in his work and really committed their lives to it. Tactical Civics didn't really get a public face until about 2021. And since then, we've grown significantly. When I joined in late 2022, there were, I think, 600 members across America from, in the entire republic. There were about 600 members, and we had a presence of at least one member in like 250 counties.
Wow. Okay.
And now we're at about 8,500 members in that neighborhood, and we're in 1,650 counties.
Wow.
And that really began at the beginning of 2023. And so that growth has happened over the past 2 years. And, we're really just really grateful because God's brought a lot of really talented, gifted, smart, successful people into our mission who have burned the ships, so to speak, and really given themselves and their resources, their time, their abilities, that they've gained through years of success in their own professions to help the mission of Tactical Civics. And they've seen, just like I did, that this really is a legitimate, peaceful, lawful, full spectrum solution to help we've been in a period for about the past 160 years of inversion in America, where the federal government has become all powerful and really all sovereign, and the sovereignty of the states and the people has been diminished illegally by circumventing the Constitution and not being held to account for it. And so we're just trying to get it turned back right side up, because we're upside down right now.
Yeah. How did that inversion happen?
Well, that's a great question. When you look at the founding generation, you look at the first decade, let's say after the Constitution was ratified, and you saw that Americans really understood how we were structured. And there was a principle that was repeated over and over and over again during the founding generation. And actually, it was a principle, and this is really important, I think, for people to realize, the principle of self-governance and the idea that governing authority didn't, and there was a shift that happened during the century before what we call the founding generation, which, most scholars call that a period that began in 1765 with the Stamp Act resistance that culminated in the Declaration of Independence and the War for Independence.
Yep.
The century prior to that, you had pastors all over New England that were articulating a pretty sophisticated view of governance. And they had come out of a period and where this, and it's even written in the Declaration of Independence, this idea that government exists by the consent of the governed. And what that really described was more of a bargain that the colonists had lived under and British subjects had lived under for centuries, which was a bargain struck between the people and the throne. We'll give you loyalty if you recognize rights and provide protection. Mm-hmm. And so over the course of the centuries, you saw how through English common law, which, is a product of the influence of the gospel of Jesus Christ on government. That's plain and simple. And you see rights growing in the sense of an understanding of what the laws of nature and the laws of God, which are synonymous, and reason dictates that every person should be afforded. And so you saw, different documents that and kind of events in British history that gave voice to the rights of British Americans. And the final one was the English Bill of Rights, and I think that was 1668, 1670, around there. And so as colonists came and settled in America, they started looking at the concepts of good government. And you can see in the pamphlets and the sermons that were printed by New England pastors during this century, from like 1640 to 1750, they started articulating a shift from this bargain arrangement where there's consent. We'll give you loyalty, you give us protection and recognize our rights. Eventually, England shifted into a dual sovereignty between, the Parliament and the Crown. But it was still a bargain in exchange of loyalty for rights and protection. They were still subjects, essentially. The shift happened when this idea that governing authority actually doesn't exist by the consent of the governed. It originates in the people. Like, that's the principle. It has its origin and is inherent in the people. And so you see that language show up in all of the state constitutions when we declared our independence. Every single state constitution, and every state that's been added to the Union since, uses the same language. They articulate that all governing authority is inherent in and consequently derived from the people. And so the officers of government are their servants and trustees and are at all times, some constitutions say amenable, others say accountable. But the principle is that the reservoir of sovereign authority is in the people at large, and the officers and the officers of government are their servants and trustees. And so in the first generation after the Constitution, you see that America, the people at large, understood that they were the sovereign authority. And so, one great example that showed how they kind of took action on this, which it never was really clear, and that's one of the things that Tactical Civics has teased out, and we'll talk about that, is okay, the people are the sovereign, but how do we actually take action based on our sovereign authority? That wasn't made very easy in our constitutional system. It's clear in the Constitution that we, the people, are at the top. We, articulate not. This wasn't the preamble of the Constitution is not a bit of poetic flourish. It's actually legal principle that we, the people, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States, and by it we create a government. We create the branches of government. They are our creatures. So we create the legislature, we create the executive, and we create the judiciary. That's based on the sovereign will of the people. Founders understood that, and they articulated it over and over. So in that first century, or that first decade, like you see with the Alien Sedition Acts with John Adams. So you had a Federalist president and a Federalist legislature who kind of came together and allowed the president, the executive branch, to accumulate more power than the Constitution said that the president should have. And so in response to that, you see the people in the several states begin to voice not only their displeasure, but to call it out as repugnant to the Constitution. And then, and we had two pretty important documents in our history that emerged out of this, but primarily the Virginia Resolution is the one that has the most import, I guess. But you had militia regiments in both Kentucky and Virginia issue both public notices and delivered notices to Congress, stating in explicit terms that these four acts, the Alien and Sedition Acts, are unconstitutional, and therefore we refuse to enforce them. So you see two things there. One, you see that the people understood that they actually had the authority to enforce the laws of the Union, which we stipulate to ourselves in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, that militia exists in part to execute the laws of the Union. And so the militia sent notices and said, we refuse to execute these unconstitutional acts. And then from that, there was a debate between Jefferson and Madison about how do the people take action when a law has been passed by Congress that's clearly in violation of the Constitution. And Jefferson, he supported just declaring it repugnant to the Constitution and refusing to obey it. Madison favored what was called interposition, where you appeal to the state governments to appeal to the federal government and do it, a little more procedural. But at the end of the day, they both understood that the people had the authority to make a determination. The idea of judicial review was not something that existed in the founding era. It's not a concept that they employed, much less would have agreed to. The idea that the founders, in creating the Constitution, surrendered the authority of the people to the judiciary to be the final arbiter of whether or not an act of Congress is constitutional, would have been an absurdity in the minds of the founders. And so you move to the first decade or two of the 19th century. Now, we had a little bit going on. We were still fighting with the British. We were fighting with the French. You had, there were a lot of things still going on. We had that War of 1812. The British were in Canada and were, doing treaties with the Indian nations. And so there was a lot going on. So it was pretty easy to take your eye off the ball in the midst of that. But what you saw in about between 1820 and 1840 was this slow creep of concentration of federal power. And that happened in a couple of ways. One is the ratio of representation began to grow and grow and grow beyond what Article 1, Section 2, Clause 4 kind of sets as the ratio. Like, here's what representation is going to look like. And when you go through and read the state ratification debates, when you read the records of the Federal Convention and hear George Washington's speech in the 11th hour of the convention to change the ratio from 1 for every 40,000, and this is the ratio of representation, change it from 1 to every 40 to 1 to every 30,000, you see that they placed a high value on keeping representative districts small. And Virginia ratification debate. I can't remember who it was right now. He was the future governor of Virginia and Senator William Carey Nicholas. And his speech on the floor of the Virginia House of Delegates in the state ratification debate when they were arguing over whether or not to ratify the Constitution, he said, I take it for granted, based on Article 1, Section 2, Clause 4, that representation will grow with the population and that it will always be no less than 1 for every 30,000. That'll be the ratio. And you hear that repeated. Small districts were important, but what the founding generation knew was that if the legislative body shrank in proportion to the size of the population, then it would be a recipe for despotism and for tyranny, because you would have an isolated and cloistered small group of lawmakers, not really cognizant of the needs of the people or the will of the people, or just in the particular areas. And so you saw that happen in 1820, 1840. It goes from 1 to every 30,000 to 1 to every 50,000 to 1 to every 75,000. Not with any, there's no legislation changing that. It's just being allowed to shrink in respect to, and some of that's by necessity. And I get that. By the time we get to 1860 and the election of Lincoln, it's at about 1 to close to 1 to 100,000, I think, in terms of ratio. So you have a small legislature in respect to the population, and then you had a president that was willing, who made a conscious decision to consolidate power in the federal government. And he didn't care how many laws he violated. He didn't care how much he transgressed the limits of the Constitution. He had decided before he ever entered office that war was going to be necessary. And then once he got into office, he was very duplicitous, Lincoln was. He lied about that. There's records of correspondence between Seward, his Secretary of State, and 2 Supreme Court justices, one from the North, one from the South, who were eager to mediate between the South and the leaders in the South and the North, and the political leaders in the South were eager to come to the table. And Seward was giving them assurances that there would be a coming together, gave them assurances that that Fort Sumter would not be, provisioned. It wouldn't be refortified. They were not going to take supplies and fortify Fort Sumter. They had given those assurances knowing that they were lying. They absolutely had every intention. So you see a lot of things. And then, when you add to that the fact that Lincoln, I think he shuttered like 300 newspapers that were publishing dissent against.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He shuttered newspapers. He deported a sitting congressman from, I believe, from Ohio, Clement Vallandigham, deported him because he was outspoken against it. He suspended habeas corpus. He issued an arrest warrant for a Supreme Court justice who denied the suspension of habeas corpus, said you can't do that. The executive doesn't have that authority. He also arrested the majority of the Maryland legislature because he believed that they were going to vote to secede. So he just arrested the legislature. He conscripted soldiers, which is not allowable under the Constitution. He also hired and conscripted and employed like 10,000 foreign fighters that weren't citizens. And the other thing about Lincoln that few people really understand is that prior to his inauguration, he had been working behind the scenes with the Senate, drafting an amendment to the Constitution forbidding the federal government from interfering with slavery in current slaveholding states. And when you look at his history with the Illinois Colonization Society, he was one of 11 managers of the Illinois Colonization Society, which had a stated goal. And this was something Henry Clay, who's from my state of Kentucky, was very active in the American Colonization Society. And their goal was the deportation of all freed blacks to either Liberia or Central and South America or Haiti or, the Caribbean. They wanted a white-only nation, and Lincoln said so explicitly in the fourth Lincoln-Douglas debate, and that's actually on record in the National Park Service website, nps.gov archives. You can look up Lincoln-Douglas debate number 4, and you can see Lincoln saying, I have no intention of ever seeing blacks vote, ever seeing blacks hold public office, ever seeing blacks intermarry with whites. There is, and he said by nature, a difference between the races, and I, as well as any other white man, intend to see the superior position afforded to the white race, because he believed that the whites were, that white people were superior to blacks in every respect. And he had met with leading black abolitionists to garner support for deportation, to start a colony in Liberia. And, so you take all of that together and, look, that was a tough situation to be in with everything that was happening. And then when you look at the fact that the 13th Amendment potentially enslaved more blacks than it freed, because it allowed, and this is kind of the origins of Jim Crow laws. It allowed criminal code to happen at the local level that by the Constitution would give local governments in the South the authority to imprison and enslave blacks, because that's the exception in the abolition, in the Emancipation Proclamation, was except in commission of a crime. So if you commit a crime, you can be enslaved. Not just put in prison, but actually, into forced servitude for commission of a crime. So all of that, and really,
Well,
Lincoln.
I have a quick
Yeah,
question
yeah.
on some of that. First off, how did I would assume it's David that found all of these things about Lincoln? Where were those available?
Yeah, there's a number of good books, highly researched. One is called "A Century of War" by John V. Denson, and he looks at three Lincoln, Roosevelt, and who's the third one that he covers in that book. He's looking at Denson analyzes and through documentation. I mean, it's a heavily researched and footnoted book.
Hmm.
How three presidents kind of created and perpetuated the military-industrial complex.
Oh, interesting.
Another good book. There's two books by Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo, who is an economist, and one's called The Real Lincoln. The other one is called Lincoln Unmasked. Again, heavily researched and documented. Another one that will absolutely blow your mind is a book by Lerone Bennett, who is a black historian and very successful businessman. He had something to do, I believe, with Ebony. Yeah, he was a publisher, editor of Ebony magazine.
Okay.
He wrote a book called "Forced into Glory: Lincoln's White Dream." And he's on record saying Lincoln wasn't the great emancipator. He wasn't the medium emancipator. He wasn't even the small emancipator. Lincoln enslaved more blacks than he ever freed. And his book is highly researched, highly footnoted. It will blow your mind and shock you what he exposes. And all of this, these aren't. The myth around Lincoln is that he was this Christian saint who sought to do the will of God, and that his heart was that his heart was in allegiance to the Christian faith. That's just not true according to the record. It was Northern clergy would joke after Lincoln's death that Lincoln was converted 6 months after he died. He was never known as someone who. What he was known as was a great rhetorician. He was eloquent. He had a great public delivery and speeches. He was a wordsmith, great communicator, and he. On record, you see him talking out of both sides of his mouth, depending on what his audience was, and so those are good. That's a good place to start. There's a long list of books that kind of uncover the Lincoln myth and that have chipped away at the gatekeepers, that have tried to, maintain the sainthood of Lincoln. And what's interesting is one of the foremost abolitionists in America, Lysander Spooner, who was also a legal scholar, who published, I should say, he wrote it in 1743. He published it in 1746, I believe, a booklet called The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. I encourage everyone to read that. It is a brilliant, and in my opinion, I'm not a lawyer, but I have a pretty good ability to reason. It is an almost unassailable argument that slavery never had been constitutional and it never had been made legal according to the constitutions of all the states at the point where we were when the Civil War happened. And so he writes this argument. It's a legal argument called The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. And it was winning, not only was it winning adherents and supporters in the North, it was also winning supporters in the South. There were Southern political leaders in the South, and I don't like using that word political leaders because it's been corrupted. But the statesmen of the South were agreeing with his argument that, it's hard to argue against the case that you've made in this book. And so Spooner hated Lincoln with a passion. And some people will argue, well, Lincoln was just a product of his time. That white nationalism was the order of the day in America. That may be a fair argument, except when you really look at what we had, you see a flourishing abolitionist movement in America that was growing significantly, beginning in the early part of the and really you look at the records of the Federal Convention, and the majority of the delegates wanted to abolish slavery when the Constitution was written. They knew that they couldn't and still keep a union together. They knew they couldn't bring the Southern states in if they abolished it, but that's what they wanted to do, and you can read that in the records of the Federal Convention. They argued on the floor that they couldn't write a constitution that would allow for the perpetuation of slavery, and so that's why they put that clause in about any persons that that the states are. I don't remember the exact language, but that the states are agreeable to allow into their states any such persons was the language that they used, and that was strategic. But they said that it wouldn't be allowed after 1808. So in 20 years, the states wouldn't be able to. They would end the slave trade. Basically, it was what that clause would. You wouldn't be allowed to bring slaves into the United States.
Yeah. But Lincoln was obviously the leader of the North, and one of the reasons that slavery was abolished. How do you kind of meld those two stories together?
Yeah, well, and again, the argument is made by a black historian like Lerone Bennett that he didn't abolish slavery. He enslaved more people than he set free, because the 13th Amendment was some crafty language that allowed Southern states to legally enslave blacks for commission of a crime. So all you have to do is find a crime that they've committed. There's a really good argument that can be made that had Lincoln actually been a statesman, that the table had been set to provide a pathway for the Southern states to end slavery and maintain their honor. One pathway that could have been done, particularly when you see the sentiment changing, not only in the North, and the North, and he was I think, what did you say, president of the North? The North was incredibly hypocritical during this period of time. Number one, slaves were treated, freed slaves were treated incredibly harshly, rights denied at every turn in the northern states. There had been multiple secession movements in the northern states decades before the southern states ever talked about seceding from the Union. So nobody talks about that, but that was reality in the North. There were northern states that were on the edge of seceding from the Union 4 decades before any southern state was talking about doing it, 3 decades before. And so the argument is that Lincoln did not pursue war to end slavery. Lincoln pursued war to end sovereignty of states and to consolidate sovereignty in the federal government. That's why Lincoln sought war.
Interesting.
And, from what I've read and from what I can see in the record, I don't think Lincoln was motivated to end slavery. Lincoln was motivated to consolidate power in the federal government, and that's what he did. And he did it in very dictatorial fashion. Now, that's a hard, that was a hard one for me to even after reading the books, that was a hard one for me to swallow, because my history and my family have a deep, deep, deep legacy in the civil rights movement. My dad taught in Tennessee and North Carolina, was a school teacher and an athletics coordinator and coach. And he lost jobs, and our family was run out of towns in the South because he insisted on integrating sports leagues in the 1950s. My oldest brother was a student at University of North Carolina in 1960 and was thrown in prison for his participation because he was a leader in a group of white students that were participating in nonviolent protest. In one instance, he and a black friend went into a whites-only restaurant and sat down. They were asked to leave. They refused. They were thrown to the floor. They were spit on, kicked, hit, urinated on, and thrown in jail. He was a part of another resistance that affected the movement of traffic, and he got thrown in jail for that. A famous segregationist judge in North Carolina that and all this is in a book called The Freedmen, I think is what the book is. And he appeared before a judge, and the judge said, "Son, if you'll admit that what you did was wrong, I'll let you walk out of here today." And my brother wrote a letter to the judge from his jail cell, and this was his senior year in college. He wasn't allowed to graduate because of this, and he wrote a letter, and it was really profound, explaining why he couldn't say that what he did was wrong. And so anyway, that's what I was brought up in. Like that's and so it was really, really hard for me to swallow this idea that Lincoln is not who I was always told that he was. And
Yeah.
I was willing to have my mind changed, and my mind has changed. I believe that if he had been a statesman, he could have navigated a way out of slavery for the Southern states, because the means were there to do it. The sentiment in America had grown to the point where it was there to do it. Congress basically in 1850 had to end the right to petition Congress for grievances because of the growth in the abolitionist movement. There was a pathway, and compensated emancipation is one that would probably have worked. And also rolling back some of the punitive trade tariffs that the South was paying 75% of import tariffs in America, and and the North was the benefactor of that. And then they passed, I can't remember what the act was called, just before Lincoln was elected, that put a 47% tariff on all imports. Well, 75% of imports came into Southern ports. And so that meant that Southern states were bearing the load. So, look, I'm not going to pretend that it would have been an easy situation to navigate, but Lincoln had already made his mind up that war was going to happen. And he really wasn't motivated because of his love for the plight of blacks. He was motivated more because of his sentiments that the federal government should be the sovereign. And he crafted some clever lies to support that in his speeches. And so,
can you talk maybe a little bit about what those were?
Well, one was that the Constitution was, how did he put it? That the Constitution was not ratified by the people of the states acting as citizens of their states, but it was ratified by the whole of the Union. That was so it was the Constitution was a creature of the whole of the Union, and was not the act of the sovereign will of the people of the individual states, which is what it was. It was an act of the individuals of the people of the individual sovereign states. And that's why that's why they had state ratification debates. That's why so he kind of crafted this picture that the federal government exists by the will of the people as a whole, and not by the will of the people as sovereign members of the individual states. And you see that in the Ninth and 10th Amendment. We make it pretty clear that any powers we didn't give the federal government were reserved to the states or the people, respectively. And so that was one of his big, kind of big lies. And the people that he was, when you look at some of the people that were surrounding him and that were a part of his presidential campaign, people that he afforded military appointments, one who was his assistant secretary of war. There was a pretty significant group, some who were German revolutionaries in 1848. They were called the 48ers, that fled Germany and came to the States, wound up in Missouri and Wisconsin, that were, fundamentally kind of pre-Marxist. That was the generation of Marx, Darwin, and Lincoln. That was really changing, a lot of the way people saw government, and all of these revolutionaries that came here from Germany believed that a strong state was absolutely necessary in order for people to have rights. That it had to be a strong central government, and that violence in order to take control of the state for the sake of the people was appropriate. And so he had made that decision before he entered office that there was going to be a war. And but that's
and then he played it out.
You read his first inauguration address, and he said there that he had no intention of ending slavery. So
yeah. How and why did Lincoln get this rebrand towards being a good guy?
Well, I think that's a good question. You can see it happen, but I think the motivation behind that, I wasn't there, and and so it's kind of conjecture to really get inside the minds of why of why he was rebranded, so to speak, or kind of sainted. And there are some people that that make the argument that that it was those who wanted to maintain the centralization of power that had him assassinated, and that he was intending to restore constitutional. That's a hard argument to make, considering how far outside the Constitution he went and was willing to stay. We had federal troops in American streets for 12 years. We had the modern day equivalent of 7.5 million people killed. Over 50%, or right around 50% of the built structures in America were destroyed during the Civil War. And that was by a shock and awe campaign by the federal government. And so, I guess it was just convenient to maintain the status quo and the outcome of the Civil War, which was a concentration of power in the federal government, which kind of began, one of the things that happened during the Civil War was the Legal Tender Act. Mm-hmm. And the Legal Tender Act was a huge blow to freedom, to liberty, to the personal to property rights. It established the predicate for our monetary policy to eventually be taken over by private banks, and not, actually done the way we said it should be done, which is by Congress. And so the passage of the Legal Tender Act was a huge, huge deal, maintaining that status quo. And you see, there's record, and Lorenzo talks about this. There's record of Northern clergy who actually despised Lincoln, doing an about face and doing a 180 and ascribing to Lincoln a very strong, deep, and sincere Christian faith. Why? I don't know. That's hard to tease out.
Yeah. You talked a little bit previously about the marriage of church and state in the beginning of the U.S. founding of the government. How did the U.S. lose the marriage of church and state?
Yeah, well, so when you look at the state constitutions prior to our Constitution for the United States and our federal Constitution, every state but one, I believe, had a statement of faith that was required for election to office of Christian faith. And, all those eventually went away. The founders, when they looked at what they had come from, when they looked at, just the whole bulk of political theory, they recognized that a government where there was a formal relationship between any established church or religious confession was a bad idea, and so they didn't go there in our federal Constitution. What's impossible to ignore is that what gave birth to America, both to the individual states and to our federal government, were principles that were squarely rooted in Scripture, and that were also squarely rooted in the gospel. That was, I think it was Madison that said that we are resting all of our political experiments on the capacity of the people to govern themselves, for self-government. Yep. Well, what gave him that idea? I mean, because he knew that he was a theology student before he was pursuing politics. And so he knew that human nature was bent towards sin and towards selfishness. So what gave him that idea? That we had a capacity for self-government. And he was a big fan and was influenced by a Dutch statesman and political theorist and theologian named Hugo Grotius in the late 16th, 17th century, who Madison called the architect of the modern code of nations. And Grotius said something on self-government that Madison took pretty seriously, and that was that I think it was something like, he shall not rule. He should not rule a nation who knows not how to manage a province, and he that cannot manage a province. He should not manage a province that cannot order a city, nor he order a city that knows not how to regulate a village, nor he a village that knows not how to guide a family, and nor should that man govern a family who knows not how to govern himself. And that's where the gospel kind of boils down, is the influence of Christ on the human heart to be ordered rightly to the world and to God, that's what self-government rests on. Madison understood that. Madison and all the founders understood that the gospel had a very deep and prevailing influence on American colonists and on the new citizens of America. And that's the only thing that would allow self-government to actually happen effectively. But they didn't establish a formal relationship with the church because they knew that that would be a bad idea, and all that would do is create dissension. What they did was they said the government is going to have no authority over the church. The government's not going to be able to make any laws establishing anything respective to a church. The government is going to stay out of the practice of religion except for one thing: to guarantee the freedom of expression and the freedom of the practice of religion. And so, that's, the founders did not envision any kind of theocracy. They didn't envision the church formally ruling in America. But what they did envision is they envisioned people who had both private virtue and public virtue, whose hearts were under the influence of the gospel, being engaged in this never before seen in the history of mankind experiment of self-government.
Yeah. Why do Americans now not understand the fact that the Constitution is only meant for a self-governing people?
Well, we've, primarily, and this is what we talk about in Tactical Civics, and it's one of we talk about three problems that we have in America, and the first problem is that we basically have. We have tacitly agreed with the idea that there's no such thing as absolute truth. And so if we tacitly agree with that, then we've prohibited ourselves from making any kind of argument or defense of absolute truth. And so self-government can't exist unless there is an absolute as the foundation of all of your principles of government that guide you. If you're not standing in a place of the absolute, who the founders understood that God was the absolute, the origin, the beginning. He was the ground of being at every moment, responsible for our lives, that Christ was the life of the soul. They understood that this was just fundamental, foundational truth that was not negotiable, that all truth, and that was not just a true statement. When we say that Jesus is the truth, we're not saying he's a truth in a category of truths competing with other truths. We say that he's the truth by which true statements are measured. And the founders understood that. But we as American citizens and as the body of Christ in America in large degree have agreed with this idea that truth is relative and that people can make up their own truths and that people can have their own version of truth. And when you do that, you can't defend truth, and you can't pursue justice. You can't pursue the rule of law, because the rule of law now is negotiable. It's negotiable what actually is law and is not law. And so the first thing that you have to do, and something that I say a lot, is that spiritual problems are incredibly resistant to non-spiritual solutions, and we just have to recognize that in America we decided that we didn't need the wisdom of God in order to govern, and that we could allow people who that it was okay for people who had no faith in God, for people who believe that we're all fundamentally accidents of nature, and that when we die we just turn into food for worms, and that's the end of it. We've been okay with that because we've had a pretty comfortable life in America. The air conditioning's working, cable's on. Our team's going to be on TV Sunday, and so it's all good. And you can read about this in Romans chapter 1. We've traded a lot of creature comfort, and we've traded the glory of the creature for the glory of the Creator. And when you do that, you get a lot of consequences as a result. And one consequence of that is just stupidity. The Scripture calls it a refusal to understand. And so we have in America a refusal to understand what is actually true about who we are as a republic, about what our structure of government actually is, not what it's been turned into, but what it actually is. What is it that the founders handed to us and said that we were obligated and responsible to keep? Well, by and large, right now in America, people are refusing to understand what that is. And that's both Christian and non-Christian alike. And so one of the things that we're doing and that we lead with when we talk about tactical civics is we humbly call people to repent. That's the only solution for sin, is repentance. And I had to do that when I joined Tactical Civics 2 years ago. I work in the church. I've lived in a God box in professional ministry for the past 25 years. But I had to acknowledge that I was content to be completely disconnected and have no consideration whatsoever about anything to do with American civics, anything to do with political economy. I had bought into all of the misinterpretations of Scripture. My citizenship's in heaven. My citizenship's not on earth. Well, yeah, that's true, but it's been misapplied. That we have no lasting city here. Yeah, that's true. My home, I have a home in Christ, and what that will be in the ages to come, I don't know, but I have that home in Him now. But I've kind of bought into this disembodied version of faith that separates the influence of the gospel from political economy and from political life, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And I've also misunderstood, and I've even taught wrongly Romans 13, because chapters verses 1 through 4 that talks about being subject to the governing authorities, and that all authority comes from God, and that they exist for a purpose and for a reason, and that is to arrest the progress of evil. They're God's messengers, and that and it's a principle. Well, I believed that just obligated me to mindlessly subject myself to the governing authorities. I never asked myself, what does that mean? Paul wrote this to a church that lived under Roman civil law, where the Caesar was the law essentially, and the legions that he commanded, and all along with Caesar worship. But what does it mean to subject yourself to the governing authorities in America? Because our system is very different from what Rome had in the first century. I didn't bother to ask that question. I just mindlessly applied it as if I was one of many subjects of a sovereign government that had the authority and the right and the full power to rule over me. And all of America has kind of been turned into a posture not too unlike what it was when we were colonists, which is we live under a sovereign and we have to plead for our rights or sue for our rights. And we're completely ignorant of even the faintest idea that collectively in America, the people actually have sovereign authority. I didn't bother to know what that was. And so I had to say, God, I'm sorry for just ignoring it. And what pushed my buttons was what everyone experienced in 2020, 2021, 2022. Mm-hmm. And I just backed up and said, okay, I don't think this is the way things are supposed to work. I don't think my governor should be allowed to order the state police to take down license plate numbers of cars that are in church parking lots on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
I don't think that's right. And
Yeah.
so then I said, God, I'm sorry. I've been stupid and I've refused to understand. And stupidity is very dangerous because you can be really smart and have a ton of knowledge and education, but still be incredibly stupid. And so when it came to American civics, I was a stupid person. And I just had to humbly say, God, I'm sorry. And I'm going to learn what my duty is and what my responsibility is. And so that's the first thing that has to happen is people have to search their own hearts. It's what I tell, it's the one prayer that God will answer. And that is, God, would you search my heart and test me and see if there's any wrong way in me, and then lead me in the way everlasting. I'm listening.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems Republicans have always run into is the fact that most of their group, most of the Republicans and Christians and conservatives, are too busy living their lives to actually worry about politics or what's happening in the civic sphere. Given that, what's the right balance? What's the right way to understand Romans 13, and what is the right duty of a Christian in the civic realm?
Yeah, well, Jackson, my prayer is that the body of Christ in America would see civic duty as a vocation, as a Christian vocation, that at some level, every member of the body of Christ should be involved in. Now, I know that that's not going to happen. Our goal in Tactical Civics is to call about 0.5%, just as our minimum of the population of America. And so what would that be of the church? Maybe 3%, 5% of the body of Christ in America, is for Christians to see that civic engagement is discipleship. It is living out your faith in fidelity to the gospel. When you look at who we are in America, so Romans 13, it says, subject yourself to the governing authority. Well, in America, we the people are the governing authority. The system that we created through our Constitution places us at the top. And we have the duty, and we stipulate to ourselves the authority to superintend our servants in government and to hold them accountable to obey the law that we gave them to follow. We created the Constitution with very clear limits and delegated powers. And their job, first and foremost, is to learn what it is to obey that. They like to call themselves lawmakers. I say, no, you first should see yourself as a law keeper, because there is a law. It's called our supreme law. In that supreme law, we clarify in Article 6, this Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land, along with treaties made and all laws made in pursuance of it. So if a law is made in pursuance, that means it's following behind the Constitution. It's in line with the Constitution. And so their job is to obey that law. Our job is to enforce that law. We have two primordial institutions that we used to understand how we effectively served and how we effectively implemented, and that's called the grand jury and the constitutional militia. Those are two ancient law enforcement institutions. They predated our Constitution by nearly 800 years, were features, fundamental features, bedrock features of English common law. The grand jury was held in absolute, it was revered in England. I think it was John Somers, who was the Lord Chancellor of England in the late 16th, early 17th century. He wrote about grand jury in a little pamphlet called The Security of Englishmen's Lives. And he said that that the grand jury was the bulwark against the tyranny of government. He said the grand jury is the guarantee that our lives cannot be drawn into jeopardy by all the malicious crafts of the devil unless a body of our honest fellow citizens are satisfied in the truth of the accusations. That was grand jury. It was a shield so the king couldn't just roll into your place and take you and your wife and your kids and your stuff just because he wanted to. Can't do that. There in the 18th century, there was a Scottish jurist named Thomas Erskine who was before the King's Bench defending the Dean of St. Asaph, and he made this really bold declaration that every person in England understood and was like, yeah. He said to the king and the King's Bench, he said, a person could commit a capital crime in the presence of the king and all his justices, and you could no more draw his life into jeopardy because of the guarantee of an indictment by a grand jury. You couldn't lay your hands on him. All you could do is assure safe passage for him, for the charges against him to be brought before a grand jury. And the grand jury could decide to refuse the indictment with the names of all your justices on the back of it. That was the authority and power and independence and scope that the grand jury had historically. Well, that was a feature of American colonial life. And there's a book that we had reprinted that was written by a University of Houston professor of history at University of Houston, named Richard Younger, I think was his name. And he pretty much his whole career was spent on studying the history of grand jury. And so he wrote this book called The People's Panel, and he examined grand jury from Massachusetts colony in 1634 up through 1941 in America. And what he lays out, just with incredible documentation, is that if it had not been for colonial grand juries, county grand juries in the colonies, there never would have been a war for independence, because most of the patriots would have all been in jail, because they were trying very hard to throw guys like John Hancock and Sam Adams and Thomas Jefferson and, patriots all throughout, Patrick Henry, all these guys they were trying to throw in jail. And at every pass in every colony, you see these stories of grand juries refusing to issue bills of indictment to the imperial justice. They were threatened. They were threatened with the fires of hell. They were told to go back into their chambers and reconvene, and given, pretty biased and threatening instructions by the imperial justice. They would come back out and say, no, we refuse, because here's what they understood. What they understood was that they weren't defending rebels. They were defending colonists who were pressing for the recognition of the rule of law, because it was the crown and parliament who was violating the law. And and they understood that they had authority to tell the imperial prosecutor and tell the imperial justices to go pound sand. John Hancock was in an admiralty jail. So, as a response to the shield of grand jury, what the Crown's justices and prosecutors and courts did was that they spun up these admiralty courts, and admiralty courts were juryless courts. And so a person could be charged and tried and imprisoned without a jury, a complete violation of the English Bill of Rights. Well, they had John Hancock sitting in a Suffolk County jail in 1769, facing charges in an admiralty court, and he would have been tried. He would have been charged, convicted, and imprisoned. But the Suffolk County grand jury initiated, because it had the authority to initiate of its own decision, they initiated an investigation into the Crown's chief witness and wound up issuing an indictment for perjury because he had perjured himself. He had lied about John Hancock. As a result of their indictment, he fled the county because he knew that an indictment by a grand jury was a serious thing. And it was serious because it was a matter of law, and the courts were obligated to proceed with criminal trial. And he knew that they had him dead to rights. And so he fled. Crown didn't have a witness to even run their admiralty court, their kangaroo court. And so they had to release John Hancock. And you see this happening over and over again throughout the colonial era. They were a shield against the tyranny of the crown and allowed the resistance to the unlawful acts of the crown to go on. Had they not existed, had there been no grand jury, well, they would have just imposed their will through the end of a gun barrel. And we wouldn't have had a war for independence.
Yeah. What's the deal with the constitutional militia?
Yeah. So the militia is the only thing the Constitution calls necessary in the Second Amendment. Mm-hmm. We say, and again, the people are doing this. The document doesn't do this. The people do this. The people created the document and obligated our servants in government to abide by its terms. We created it's the highest law. So in our highest law, we say that militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Mm-hmm. So we say militia is necessary, and then we say the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Those are two conjoined phrases that the founders never even suggested could ever be separated as two separate things. The founding generation understood that the people at large should, by duty, they were duty bound to bear arms and to keep arms, and then to do so for the purpose of volunteering to serve in militia. And so colonial militia was a part of, and again, it had an 800-year history, both militia and grand jury. You can trace back to 997 AD in the case of grand jury, 1014 AD in the case of militia with the dooms of Ethelred. Both were features of the rule of law, not rebellion, the rule of law. And so we say in the Constitution, militia is necessary to the security of a free state. And then we also stipulate in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, that militia exists to enforce the laws of the Union and to suppress insurrections and repel invasions. But their first job is an enforcement duty. What the founders articulated over and over and over again. We could sit here all day and go through recitations by the founders and what they understood militia to be. You can read Federalist 46 and see how Madison talked about militia and the security that militia provided, and that it was the body of the people at arms connected to a subordinate government. Were they envisioning private military groups? No. They were envisioning a well-ordered, regulated, officers appointed, connected to the elected magistrate. There was always to be a relationship with the elected magistrate. And so we didn't in the Constitution anywhere authorize Congress or the executive or the judiciary to redefine militia, to alter its purpose, to call it something else, to limit its scope and its vital function to the security of a free state. We didn't authorize that anywhere, but they did it anyway. And that's a part of our sin, is that we've allowed that to happen, and we haven't bothered ourselves to learn how can I stop the criminal violations of our highest law by our servants in government who work for us, that we've employed. I mean, and so that's supposed to exist. It's supposed to exist. Now, we're way down the road. from they basically killed militia. The 1903 Dick Act was one big part. The Civil War was one big part, with the federalization of troops on American soil. That is entirely repugnant to the Constitution. The federalization of troops on American soil, just without end.
Right.
And so it still exists by law. Militia still exists by law, and just because Congress has passed and presidents have signed and judiciaries have looked the other way, laws repugnant to the Constitution, laws that have assumed authorities that were nowhere granted in the Constitution. When that happens, that's called arbitrary authority, which is always leads to tyranny, and it always leads to authoritarianism. It always leads to some sort of, whether it's a technocracy or some sort of rule by the few making subjects of the many. That's what happens when the rule of law is allowed to be violated with impunity. That gets us back to Romans 13:1. If we have a duty to oversee and superintend our service in government, and we also have an enforcement duty. When grand jury is impaneled, is the highest authority on criminal violations of the law in the land. There is no higher authority when it comes to determining reasonable cause to believe that a law has been criminally violated. No one can countermand the decision of a grand jury. No one.
Yeah.
Courts can't infringe their investigations, nor can a court say you're not allowed to investigate on suspicion of a criminal violation of the law. Grand jury can initiate investigations not only if the people, now this isn't government or officers of government, this is the people. If the people impaneled or the public interest determines that it's necessary, they can not only have the authority to, and this is in a 1992 Supreme Court case called U.S. versus Williams, where Scalia writes about this in pretty exhaustive detail. But the grand jury has the authority to initiate investigations on suspicion. Also, if it merely wants to have the assurance that the law is not being criminally violated by their servants in government, they can proceed with an investigation, and they don't have to notify the court. They don't have to notify the target of their investigation. They don't have to reveal the nature of their investigation. They have the authority to summons witnesses. They have the authority to arrest for evidence. And the court is obligated to act upon the decisions of a grand jury and to act upon their requests. The only thing they can't do is abrogate someone's constitutional rights. That's it. And so we have two law enforcement institutions that still belong to us. There are about 20 states that still do grand jury according to the traditional principles of grand jury and constitutional stipulations of grand jury. They still do it according to our primordial tradition, the way it's always been done in English common law. About 20 states that do it the right way.
What are the
that are straddling the line? The legal profession hates grand jury. I'll just say that. They pretty much killed it and got rid of it in England. And there's a long history of how the legal profession, as the legal profession grew and became, a source of enrichment and power, the legal profession in England just relentlessly attacked grand jury. The legal profession in America has attacked grand jury. They'll use pejoratives like, witch hunts. That's all that talking about restoring the constitutional and primordial function of grand jury is just, engaging in witch hunts. Well, the constitutional function of grand jury is such that you can't engage in witch hunts. It's impossible. You just can't do it because of how it's designed and how it functions. What you can do is you can fulfill a duty to serve, and you can impose the rule of law. You can make a determination. A grand jury can make a determination that a law passed by Congress, by your state legislature, is no law because it violates the Constitution. We've done it before. We used to understand this. During the 1850s, we had grand juries in the Missouri Territory who were basically declaring that the fugitive slave law, which was eventually determined to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but it shouldn't have to be. The people should be able to make that determination, and they did in the Missouri Territory. There were grand juries in the Missouri Territory in different counties there, or municipalities. It hadn't been made a state yet, but the grand juries in the Missouri Territory were saying no. The Fugitive Slave Act is unconstitutional. Anyone who is arrested for violating it is not guilty of any crime. And so they were making that determination of law, and it could not be countermanded by any court or any judge.
Yeah. What are the dangers of a grand jury and a constitutional militia?
A lot less than the dangers of a lawless federal government.
Yeah.
Like by many factors. Why is that? Well, when our federal government and our servants in government, called public servants, are allowed to step outside of the limits of the Constitution with impunity, like with no, and what's being revealed right now with Doge and Trump and the things that are being uncovered, this recent thing with the United States Agency for Peace, or Institute for Peace, or something like that. They were living like kings. It was like an episode from The Office. I mean, it was bizarre what they were doing, having portraits painted of directors. One director for an entire year had all of his expenses driving to work and back home and eating lunch declared as business expenses, as if he had been on a year-long business. It's just bizarre. They were paying ex-employees of the agency. One guy got paid $85,000 on somebody's credit card for a call center that doesn't exist. There was no address and no phone number for whatever call center it was that he was supposedly service he was providing. He was paid $85,000 by a credit card. It's bizarre. So here's the thing. When that's allowed just to go on, and it has been for generations, we've allowed our federal government to wildly step outside of the limits of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. It poisons the very concept of the well of the rule of law at the source. When our highest law is violated by the servants that we employ to execute it, to abide by its stipulations, when they violate it and they're not held to account, then it poisons at the source the rule of law in America. And that's why our court system is such a laughingstock now. That's why you've seen the weaponization of the Department of Justice. You've seen these wild changes in state law just to accommodate a prosecution, is because the whole rule of law itself at its very source has been poisoned. So people are inclined, because it sounds, and this is not some atavistic urge to return to the good old days. This really is about restoring the rule of law and the people assuming responsibility to enforce it. That really is how can the creatures which we created in the Constitution police themselves and enforce the law that created them? It's our duty to do that. We've just lost our understanding of what that even means. the reason grand jury is not dangerous is because its members are chosen by a blind draw at random. Their deliberations are to be held in secret, and no one is to know who they are. They have a term where if nothing is brought to their attention, then that grand jury ends its term and it's no longer seated. And at the next term, a new grand jury will be seated unless the public interest determines that the impaneling of a grand jury is necessary. If that happens, then the court is obligated to impanel a grand jury. And the proper process, it prevents, and this goes all the way back. Thomas Jefferson was having a disagreement with Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was trying to get customs officials to report to him anyone who violated the neutrality laws. And Jefferson said, no, wait a minute, you can't do that. That needs to be left to the province of grand jury. Why? Well, he explained, because no grand juror can participate in an ongoing persecution of his neighbor whom he hates because he's not permanent in the office. He has a limited term. And so people can't take hold of grand jury for their own political vendettas. Grand jury is a lawful function that belongs under the aegis of the people, and not because government cannot be held to account by government.
Right. Yeah, and part of the reason that grand jury sounds like it's so impressive and also somewhat foolproof is because there's such short term limits. More or less, that these people have. And so it's kind of, you're in, people don't know who you are, so there's no worry that you're going to be blackmailed or put under social pressure to act one way when you should act another way, and you should act another way, and then you're out, and it's done. And so,
Precisely.
How do we as American people bring back the correct understanding and the correct acting out of the grand jury and the constitutional militia?
Yeah, and what we're trying to do in Tactical Civics is and we're trying to do this at the county level, and so we're building county chapters, and we have a target number, for all our counties that we're trying to build to. And as we build our county chapters, we're educating members on the constitutional function of grand jury and the constitutional function of militia. Our first target, our first goal, is to pursue passage of our grand jury ordinance. And so that's county law. And all it does is, it's nothing radical. It just restores the constitutional function, independence, authority, and scope of inquiry of grand jury. And it provides a mechanism by which people have access to get their names on the roster to volunteer to serve, not to get guaranteed access, but to be guaranteed that they're a part of the roster that grand jury is selected from. And our ordinance also has a stipulation that ensures that the selection process is uncorrupted, and so it requires that the selection process be observed by officers of the county government to ensure that it's not corrupted in any way. And we put some obligations on the county clerk of the court, the county clerk, to maintain a standby roster. We provide a mechanism for people to submit an application to volunteer to serve on grand jury. We also provide a means by which people can make presentments to the grand jury, that can if there's a suspicion of criminal actions by our servants in government, or just in our communities in general. We can put that before the eyes of the grand jury, and then it's up to the grand jury to make the determination on whether to proceed with investigation if it rises to that level. We also put a threshold in our ordinance that sets a number. If a certain number of presentments are delivered to the foreman of the grand jury or delivered to the county clerk, if there's a certain number around any single issue, then the clerk of the court is required to pass that on to the sitting grand jury. And if one is not sitting, then we obligate, which the law obligates this, really. All we're doing is, federal rules of criminal procedure make this pretty much a statement of law and of fact, and which is because it's a part of the history and tradition of grand jury, is when the public interest deems that it's necessary, the presiding or constituting court is required to impanel one. And so all we're doing is establishing that at the county level. We're putting that obligation on the county court that if the public interest determines that it's necessary, the grand jury needs to be impaneled, and then they need to be delivered with a presentment of suspicion or accusations of criminal violations of the law. And so that's all we're doing. We're just restoring that. And then we're educating the citizens of our counties how grand jury functions. And I'll just share a story that happened in my county. I was doing a presentation on grand jury, and one of our Tactical Civics members who served on grand jury came up to me afterwards and said, everything you said about grand jury, the way that it was, originally designed to function and historically how it's functioned, is exactly what the judge told us. And our oath that we took and the instructions that it was right straight down the line with everything that you said. But then when we got into the chambers, the Commonwealth's attorney walked in and said verbatim, I know what the judge said, but let me explain how we do it here in our county. And then proceeded to tell them, look, we know you're busy. We don't want this to take any more time than it absolutely has to. You're not getting paid much to do this. So I'll run the investigation. I'll, determine, I'll draw up the summons. I'll do all that, I'll do all that work. I'll call in the witnesses. I'll present the evidence, and you just listen. And then that's it. That's all I want you to do. Is I just want you to listen to, to the cases that I'm going to bring. And one of the guys raised his hand and said, because he had just been given instructions by the judge, and he said, can we ask questions of witnesses? And she said,
yeah.
If you have any questions that you'd like to, present to a witness, write them down and hand them to me. I'll determine whether or not they're material to the case. Now, every person in that chamber, every member of the grand jury just went, oh, okay. None of them had any idea that they were the authority in the room, not the Commonwealth's attorney. They were legally, they are the highest authority, and that they could have said, well, thank you, Madam Prosecutor, but we would like to go over what you have. We'd like to look at that and discuss it, as is our authority, to do that in secret, and we'll let you know when we need you.
Yeah.
You can leave now.
Yeah.
And just humbly and politely.
Yeah.
But we have to relearn and take hold of the authority that is ours by the law. Scalia in that Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Williams, he lays all of this out in detail of what the authority of the grand jury is, and then you can see it in detail when you trace through the history of it and how the grand jury actually functioned from the century of colonial settling in America, and then into the War for Independence, and then into our constitutional system, and then on up into the middle of the 19th century. You see grand jury functioning the way that it should. You also see militia functioning the way that it should. Look, militia is not a bunch of guys in a gun club running around out in the woods with camo and eye black that have no idea what they would do in a real situation. It's just our neighbors. I live in rural Western Kentucky. We've got volunteer fire departments all over Western Kentucky. They're people we go to church with. They're people that we work with. We run into, our kids play soccer together, and they're trained, they're equipped they're resourced by by the community, by the local government, and they volunteer, and they're trained to respond to an emergency in the event that an emergency occurs, and they know how to respond. They've been trained how to respond, and they've been resourced. Militia is just that. It's our neighbors who have been trained, they've been disciplined, they've had officers appointed from officers nominated from among their ranks. They're able-bodied. The structure is connected with the county government. There's a county militia liaison that works with paid law enforcement. We don't want to take over.
Defund the police.
Yeah, we don't want to defund them. They have a very important job that we value and we want to see them do. But they are agents of the government, and it should not be their job to police the same. And it's been a principle that is baked into our founding, into every state constitution, and into our federal constitution, that it's the people's job to police government. And so that's why militia is indispensable. If a grand jury were made aware of some suspected criminal violation of the law by a county judge executive, or by a city mayor, or a councilman, or a police chief, or a sheriff, or an election board supervisor, or a school board superintendent, or whatever. If a grand jury was made aware of that, and that anonymous grand jury selected at random of our honest neighbors, proceeded upon inquiry and looked into it, and upon that investigation discovered that there's reasonable cause to believe that a crime actually has been committed, and they issue an indictment. Well, if that indictment if the target of that indictment, or the subject of that indictment, involves public servants, then we've put other public servants in a very compromised position by expecting them to enforce the decision of the people. And our system always envisioned that there would be an enforcing body of the people at arms, the sword of the shield of the grand jury, if you want to refer to it that way, that body would always exist to act on a grand jury's determinations. And that's what we have to return to. And so at the county level, we just envision good, honest neighbors, able-bodied, trained, well-trained, well-disciplined, ordered, officered, and connected to the elected magistrates. So there's a command structure. There's a chain of command. There's communication, liaisons with local, but just to serve that vital function, because
a government run once again by we the people.
A government run once again by we the people, and not just through elections. See that's a really small obligation
step
of civic duty.
Yeah. Jeff, I'm sure we could talk much more. I'd love to have you back on the show at some point. There's a lot we're unable to discuss.
There, Jackson. There really is.
There really is. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's a big vision. It really is. Tactical Civics vision is a big vision, but it's worth pursuing. It really is.
Absolutely.
Because I don't think there's another pathway than what we're putting in place, and it's just the people being the people collectively once again.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say, Jackson, is who better to make determinations of law and justice with a right orientation towards mercy? Who else to bear the sword in order to arrest the progress of evil than those whose hearts are under the influence of the gospel of Jesus Christ?
Absolutely.
Scripture says we have the mind of Christ. Scripture says that we're going to judge angels. Are we not able to restore the rule of law in America as an act of Christian vocation, as an act of fidelity to our faith? lived out.
Yeah. No, absolutely. This is an exciting new field, and I'm hopeful over the course of the next 4 years, but also just continuing on from then, that Christians begin to take up their civic duty a little more thoroughly. Given our conversation, what's your best piece of advice you would give to anyone watching?
Pray sincerely.
Yeah.
Just ask God, what would you have me do? And
Yeah.
and
That's
we have an incredible resource of learning tools. You can go to tacticalcivics.com. There's a 12-minute video where I explain our mission. I'm in the process of recording a new one, or putting a new one together. You can avail yourself of all of our books, all of our resources, and learn what it is to be a part of the collective sovereign in America. And there's another website where you can go and learn kind of the biblical basis for what we're doing, and it's nwwr.online, and that's an 11 video series where I just kind of break down our mission, and it's kind of biblical. It's biblical basis, and so I would encourage you to go there. But first thing you have to do is you have to pray. Like, you just have to ask God, show me where I've been, I've refused to understand, and show me what I need to do. And if you'll just pray that prayer, God always answers a prayer like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put links in the description. Jeff, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Hey,
thank you so much for coming on the show.
You ask great questions.
Yeah, thank you. See you guys.
See you.